Welcome to the inaugural edition of Africa Monthly, exclusively on Africa in Perspective, where we look at some of the biggest talking points from around the African continent that has taken place over the past month. So here is what is coming up. Bouteflika and Bashir out after nationwide protests. What next for Algeria and Sudan? Jumia, the first African startup to be listed in the New York Stock Exchange. But is it really African? The Africa Cup of Nations groups are drawn. Who will win the showpiece tournament in Egypt? So, let's get started. The month of April has been an unprecedented month when talking about leadership in Africa because we've seen two leading heads of state who have ruled for close to 2 or 3 decades respectively in their respective countries step down from power. So we start off with Algeria, the largest country in Africa by landmass. Algeria has been led for the past 20 years by an ailing and elderly leader by the name of Abdelaziz Bouteflika. President Bouteflika has made rare public appearances since 2013 when he suffered a stroke. His attempt to run for a fifth term as president at the age of 82 sparked outrage across Algeria. Within 10 days of the announcement of his candidacy for a fifth term in office, protests were held across the country. This pressure from the protests compelled the military to call for a swift resignation of President Bouteflika. On 2nd of April 2019, it was announced in state media that President Bouteflika would resign with immediate effect. The resignation of Bouteflika has been received with joy and elation. Nonetheless, some Algerians say that they have won the battle but have still not won the war. Protesters are still calling for a complete overhaul of the system to be replaced with a truly democratic government. The constitution stipulates that the head of the upper house will take over for an interim period of 90 days, and during that time, a presidential election must be organized. It will be interesting to see how the situation develops. I salute the bravery of the Algerian people and hope for a peaceful and successful transition. We move on now to Sudan, where protests that have been running for months culminated in the resignation of President Omar al-Bashir, who has ruled Sudan for 3 decades. The protests began in December 2018 in the city of Atbara, where hundreds protested against the tripling of the price of bread. These protests slowly morphed into a full-blown anti-government protest and rallies across the country that called for President al-Bashir to step down from office. The subsequent government crackdown was relentless. According to different reports, a number of journalists, academics, and opposition leaders have been incarcerated. There were further reports that the government also cracked down in public areas such as hospitals and schools. Following months of relentless pressure and protest, President Omar al-Bashir stepped down on April 11th. The military has taken over government functions temporarily, promising that it would hand over power to a civilian government. The protests are still ongoing. The Sudanese people are still flocking the streets of Khartoum and cities across the country, demanding a full transfer of power to a civilian government immediately. One key feature of the protest has been the leading role of women, who have come out to stand up against the regime. An iconic symbol that will forever be etched in the memory and history of the world is of 22-year-old student Ala Salah mobilizing people during the protests. So do you think that there will be similar uprisings and revolutions, so to say, in other African countries during the course of this year, drawing inspiration from both Algeria and Sudan? I think that remains to be seen, but I'm highly doubtful about it. Nonetheless, I'm sure other people from different African countries that are living under dictatorial or autocratic regimes will be watching the developments closely and trying to learn from it. So we move on now to the world of business, where Jumia, an e-commerce platform that is operational in close to 15 countries around the continent, has become the first African startup to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. But people are really questioning whether or not it's an African startup. Let's get to know more. Jumia has often been described as the Amazon of Africa and started operations in Nigeria in 2012 as an e-commerce platform that has grown exponentially and now has operations in 14 countries around Africa. Jumia has been lauded as an African startup despite having none of its top management from the African continent. The status of Jumia as an African startup has come under scrutiny since its listing on the New York Stock Exchange. The CEO of Jumia recently spoke on CNBC on the IPO of Jumia and was questioned about the element of being African.
Jumia operates in Africa, but your headquarters are in Germany and Dubai. Top executives are French. Your engineering talent's in Portugal. Is it important to get technical talent in Africa to be more?
A number of leading voices in the African technology space have highlighted the appropriation of African identity by Jumia. This saga perhaps puts into perspective how much still needs to be done to empower African entrepreneurs. So we're just less than a month and a half away from the Africa Cup of Nations, a showpiece tournament for all the national football teams from across the African continent. I'm particularly excited on a personal level because it's the first time in 15 years that my home country, Kenya, the Harambee Stars, have qualified for the tournament. So the draw for the groups was made April 12th in Cairo, Egypt. So it'll be interesting to see some of the permutation and how teams will do during the tournament. So let's have a closer look at what the groups have been drawn up. We have some very tough matchups across all groups, but perhaps the toughest group, or what is often called the group of death, is in my opinion Group D, that includes 2015 winners Ivory Coast, 1996 winners South Africa, Morocco, and Namibia. The defending champions Cameroon will be looking to make their mark on the tournament after the remarkable and almost unexpected run to the title in the last edition. Egypt appear to be the clear favourites to win the tournament because of their history of success in the tournament with 7 Africa Cup of Nations to their name. They have home advantage and have perhaps the best player in Africa right now and among the best in the world in Mo Salah. Watch out for an in-depth analysis in the coming weeks. So there's a new little segment that I've created called Book of the Month. So we'll be making recommendations on books that I recommend all of you to get your hands on. And the book I want to start with today is called The Good African Story, How a Small Company Built a Global Coffee Brand. It's by Andrew Rugasira, a young Ugandan entrepreneur. Very inspiring story about how he was able to get a global coffee brand up and running in his home country, Uganda. The book starts with a very important debate about why Africa is underdeveloped, why we don't have really developed economies. It's pretty heavy at the start in terms of theory, and I'm sure for those of you who are business enthusiasts who want to get into the thick of things about how he started his entrepreneurial journey, we'll have to wait for a bit because he goes to talk about that in later chapters. But I think it's an important debate, despite it being it was very heavy in theory initially, but I think he makes some really important observations about why Africa is underdeveloped and kind of puts it into perspective, and it kind of seeps into eventually the issues that he faced as an entrepreneur on the African continent. I think one of the best things about this book is that he's very vulnerable and very open about his own shortcomings, about the challenges about being an African entrepreneur. And he also kind of bemoans the fact that there are not a lot of African entrepreneurs who kind of talk about their trajectory of the challenges they had from a very personal and vulnerable point of view. You just hear the success stories, you hear about people such as Dangote, you hear people about, other entrepreneurs are all over the African continent, but you don't really hear the nitty-gritties about the challenges they face. So I really love this book. I think it's a must-read for any anybody entrepreneur on the African continent. It's a must-read for people who want to better understand why African economies don't work and what can be done to kind of alleviate that situation, and also the role of entrepreneurship in kind of transforming the African continent. I think it's a very important book. So get yourself a copy of A Good African Story by Andrew Rugasira. Wonderful read, very illuminating. And I'm sure a lot of you must have read this. Not a very new book, but for those of you who haven't read it, please get a copy. So we're trying to run a poll and trying to get your views on some of the developments that are happening around the African continent. And the question we have for you during this episode is that, do you think there will be another long-term African leader or dictator that will fall during the course of this year? You can find the Twitter poll on our Africa in Perspectives Twitter page. I'll leave the link down below so you can be able to cast your vote. So we will close this episode of Africa Monthly by focusing on Rwanda, who this month of April commemorated 25 years since the genocide took place. Rwanda, of course, has been lauded as a wonderful example of being able to build a country post such a traumatic and absolutely terrible event. Despite some of the questions around democracy and freedom of expression in Rwanda, there's no doubt that Rwanda has made remarkable strides since that time to be able to rebuild its country, rebuild its economy, and try to instill some type of order in the country. So we want to end by commemorating and remembering the genocide that took place, and hopefully no such atrocity will take place ever again, be it in Africa or anywhere else in the world.
In the end, the only conclusion to draw from Rwanda's story is profound hope for our world.